Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, Pennsylvania schools learning in person or by remote, but first, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Bryan Cutler, joins me, and we're going to chat about, how about $7 billion? How about election law changes and more? And we'll do that after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome Bryan Cutler. He represents the 100th Legislative District. He's been on the program several times. We're delighted to have him on. Mr. Speaker, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me back, Dr. Madonna.
Well, I'll
certainly
tell you,
a pleasure.
Yeah, we have a bunch of subjects to get to, so I want to get to them. Let's talk first about the state budget, but I definitely want to get to 3 or 4 other topics. You now have $7 billion out of, money from the federal government. I think it came to Pennsylvania from the American Rescue Plan. And you've got to get this done this month, at least that's what the Constitution says. The legislature doesn't always get it done on time, right?
No, unfortunately, that's correct. The last 2 years when I was leader, we had budgets done early, which I certainly appreciated working with the Senate and the governor on those. But you are correct. June the 30th is the deadline for our fiscal year, so we're working towards accomplishing the budget and all the related bills. Specific to the federal money that came in, that certainly has been a big help in terms of backfilling some of our tax revenue shortfalls. We had predicted last year, as we did our revenue estimates, that this year would be very difficult. And fortunately, there are segments of our economy that are performing much better, but unfortunately, there are several that are still struggling. So the federal money can be used for a variety of different things. And we also have to keep an eye out because the federal money is designed to be spent over the next 2 to 3 years as we look forward. Because just as the pandemic took a long time to get through, the recovery will likely take longer. And there are projected shortfalls in the coming years as well. In year 3, there's potentially a $4 to a $7 billion deficit that will come online, and we need to be prepared for that. So some of the money we will put in the rainy day fund, and then we will look to have targeted investments in other areas of our economy to get our economic engine going again here in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, one of the big aspects of the budget has to do with infrastructure. We've talked about on this program many, many times because of its significance with the varied geography and topography that exists in this state. Is that any of that money likely to go for infrastructure, or will that get handled in the normal way?
Well, right now it will be handled in the normal way. Obviously, we're also all kind of waiting and seeing what the federal government will do in terms of an actual infrastructure plan. It looks like that might be pushed off to the fall. But I think it's important to remember that the money that we save maybe in this budget process to use over the next couple budgets could also still be used for that in the future. But you are correct. We've got more roads and bridges in terms of miles and crossings than all of the New England states combined. So that is certainly a challenge. Our freeze thaw cycles are also a challenge here. We have many more because in the Northeast, for example, when it freezes, it stays frozen. Our neighbors to the south, such as Delaware and Maryland, have a sandy soil, so they don't get quite the soil disruption during the freeze thaw cycles. So we have some unique challenges here, but thankfully we've also got some unique opportunities in terms of our great workforce, our geography, and our abundance of natural resources. So we need to optimize all of that going forward.
All right, let's turn to another topic. State Government Committee Chair Seth Grove has introduced, I'll call it this, an election code bill. But the fact of the matter is that Democrats and Republicans are really on a different page when it comes to election code reform. First of all, what are the major elements in that bill? And then we can talk about whether they're likely to pass. And if they do, the governor might well veto it. So it's still a tough choice to make.
Well, let's go back in time. Our election law had not been updated in nearly 8 decades. And the House Republicans led that effort last legislative session. And it doesn't surprise me that there's a difference in opinion on how to go forward. Because if you go back to Act 77, the majority of the Democratic caucus voted against mail-in ballots. And that was a component of that which was thankfully available when it came time for the pandemic and the response. In fact, we actually won a court case that wanted to mail a ballot out to every registered voter because there was already a process in place that had security features in it. Now, there was a series of court cases that overturned many of those security features. But that was actions of the Supreme Court, not the legislature. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the current proposal, Representative Grove had, I believe it was 30 hours of hearings. He had a variety of testifiers in from all across the nation and to discuss the best practices. His premise is very simple: make it easy to vote, hard to cheat. There are security components in it, one of which is voter ID. But let's keep in mind that we already have a voter ID requirement here in the Commonwealth.
We're going to run to a break. I want to continue on this subject, but you're right. But that involves first-time voters, I think. But you'll clarify that and set me straight, and we will do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, I'm chatting with the Speaker of the House, Bryan Cutler, and at the moment we're talking about election code, if you will, or election changes. They're somewhat controversial. I think the Speaker would agree with that. And one of the issues that really has drawn opposition, particularly from many Democrats, has to do with voter ID. That would be required of all voters, as I understand it, Mr. Speaker. All voters every time they vote. Is that correct?
That is correct. Currently in state law, there's a requirement for first-time voters when they appear at the polls for the first time. Like, for example, my daughter recently became a registered voter, so she had to provide ID when she came to the polling place. But the law proposal as drafted would not only require it, but it would also provide multiple methods by which you could meet that requirement, up to and including simply signing an affidavit acknowledging your identity.
Yeah, and you could use driver's licenses and passports, correct, a whole variety. You don't have to bring in your birth certificate and hold it up, right?
Correct. No, that's there's a variety of things. I think there's 14 or 15 options, including the affidavit, that would be available. In addition to that, the proposal includes a requirement that the counties essentially send everybody a durable voter registration card, which would also qualify.
All right. Another important topic has to do with lobbyist rules, and we hear an awful lot about it. And here's a quote from you. The voters of Pennsylvania already have lobbyists working for them. Their lobbyists are the 203 members of the House and 50 senators. So where does that all go? As you know, lobbyists are very powerful, They have great influence over what becomes law in this state. And what does your proposal do?
Well, I think we need to start out with the premise of how the legislature is made up. We're a wide and diverse body. We all have different life experiences. However, we're not all experts. So lobbyists do have a role in terms of educating individuals on some issues that might come up. It's important to recognize that. Being from Lancaster County, I'm familiar with agriculture, for example. I used to work in the healthcare industry. Those are things I feel quite comfortable discussing and voting on. However, I don't know or didn't know when I first came the first about coal mine. So one of the first things I did was called individuals who represented the coal mining industry and said, can you please explain the process to me? I got to go underground in a mine. So there is a role for individuals to play in terms of issues education. What the package of bills, there's 11 bills and one resolution, are looking to do is simply provide more transparency and public accountability in terms of how that process plays itself out. I think that one of the things that I talked about the last time I introduced my first lobbyist disclosure update, which was nearly 14 or 15 years ago, and it was the most recent one to be signed into law back in 2018 with Governor Wolf. I always said, if you don't believe in the process, you'll never believe in the product. That could apply to lobbying reform. It could apply to the election process. It could apply to any number of issues that we encounter as both policymakers and citizens. So all 11 bills in the resolution simply looks to increase transparency, increase accountability. It requires ethics training. It requires disclosure. And the resolution that I personally worked on deals with the distinction that currently exists in law that lawyers are treated differently than registered lobbyists. For example, if I were to leave the House, as a former House member, I would be prohibited from lobbying the chamber for 1 year. However, if you're an attorney, you are under the jurisdiction of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and there is no prohibition there, and you could begin lobbying immediately. And all the resolution will simply do is ask that the Supreme Court apply the same standards to lawyers as we currently have in state law for all other lobbyists. I think we ought to have the same set of rules.
Right. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for coming on the program. You're always welcome. And coming up next, we're going to get into the whole business of in-person or remote learning. What's the situation in Pennsylvania public schools after these words?
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, imagine this, 500 school districts in the state of Pennsylvania, 1.7 million students. And we're going to talk about a number of important education topics. And joining me to do that is Aaron Chapin. He's the Vice President of the Pennsylvania State Education Association. They represent the teachers and the coaches. Do I have that right?
Teachers and the support professionals across the state.
More broadly, right, support professionals.
Correct.
Thanks. All right, here we go. Many school districts at the end of this year were back in person learning. So you have in-person learning and you have remote learning. Where does all this go? What have educators said about how difficult it is to go back and forth with those two systems?
Well, first of all, Terry, it's great to be with you today. Thanks for having us in. And it has been one of those crazy years. The past school year, our educators and support professionals, they have performed heroically. There have been so many different models that have taken place across the state. While you've had some that have been actually completely in person, you've had some completely remote. And then there's a lot of districts where the staff had a class in front of them, and at the same time they had a class at home. And it was exhausting for many of our members, and they often tell us this is one of the greatest challenges, the hardest and toughest years. But there's been a lot of educators that have also said, as they've seen the kids come back to the classroom, that it's been an absolute joy and thrill to see them after all this time.
Yeah.
So
I'll tell you, remote learning, I mean, it is very difficult. And then when you bounce back and forth, not just for the teachers, which, it's virtually unprecedented, but what about the fall? Are students going to be in person? It looks like we're going to be in person, and if COVID-19 stays in its reduced capacity, we're likely to have classes in person, but some teachers might like that Zoom.
Well, I don't know if I can attest that they enjoy the Zoom. I think a lot of us are zoomed out, but we have a lot of optimism when it comes to next fall. And of course, that's the big question right now, what next year is going to look like. But with the vaccination program that took place this year, that's a major step forward. And of course, we want to see as many staff and students get vaccinated throughout the summer and start to work its way down through the younger grades.
Good point.
That will be the telling factor. It's still continue to listen to the science, listen to the guidelines from the CDC and the Pennsylvania Department of Health, but we just have to see where it all kind of plays out over the summer with those factors.
Yeah. And many colleges and universities are requiring students and staff to get vaccinated. And that's created, let's face it, that's created some controversy. And that controversy is likely to continue. But what do you think, if we get this big shift back in person, that's still going to create problems of its own for obvious reasons, right?
Well, it depends on what kind of problems you think. What kind of problems do you think might come about?
Well, they're going to have, if they don't require vaccinations, then you're going to have this situation where, they may be not symptomatic, but have COVID, and some have predicted a spike up in that.
But I think as long as school districts continue to listen to the science, and for our younger students, it's an absolute must that they continue to wear those masks until vaccinations become a lot more prevalent in our younger students. But just need to follow the science, the distance requirements or suggestions, as well as wearing the masks. And, as we've seen throughout the winter and spring, that's really helped tremendously as our students have come back into the classroom.
Well, let's run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the unprecedented federal resources that schools are going to get from the American Rescue Plan. We had the Speaker of the House on before you, and I asked him about the $7 billion and what that all means. And we'll get to that subject after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
Aaron Chapin is my guest. He's the Vice President of the Pennsylvania State Education Association, often referred to as PSEA. All right, you're going to get an unprecedented amount of money from the federal program, the American Rescue Plan. What role are teachers going to play in deciding how that money is spent, particularly when there's only one purpose for schools, right? Mm-hmm. It's called students and learning. Put that together, correct?
Well, and we're excited about this unprecedented amount of money. It's really a once in a generation opportunity, and we're hoping that school districts will invite our educators to the table to be part of that process, because ultimately they really are the experts when it comes to how this money could be spent and what it could be used for, and our input would be greatly valuable to them.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. The teachers understand and are aware of the needs right in the classroom, and that's, education of the students. That's the whole reason to have a school district.
Absolutely, and we're hoping that opportunity is available.
All right, there are learning gaps, and, some of it has to do with remote learning versus in person, and I think a lot of our viewers are keenly aware of that. So what specifically do students need to help close those learning gaps? That's
a great question, and it's a question that all school districts are going to be facing right now into the summer, but certainly there's going to be summer programs, there's going to be some after-school programs. Sure. We should be focusing on student mental health. There's a lot of students that have experienced some trauma due to the past 16 months, and we need schools to add school psychologists, right, guidance counselors, school nurses, which again, this was already an issue before COVID, and really because we have to address our students' mental health in order for them to be able to excel as they return to in-classroom learning.
Yeah, I mean, look, if they have mental health issues, learning's not going to be easy.
Correct.
And so do you think that, do you have any idea about how the money will be spent?
Again, I think it's going to vary from district to district. There's so many opportunities available. Certainly, with $1 billion of that $5 billion is going to go towards just instruction alone. But there's also building renovations. There's revamping the HVAC systems, the ventilation systems, getting rid of contaminants like mold, asbestos, and lead. A lot of our buildings are falling apart as we speak, and this will be a great opportunity to bring them back to life and give kids a great learning environment.
Yeah, that's an important point. But there's also a critical question about how long will it take for students to get back on track, where they need to be. Yeah. And maybe that's too hard to answer.
Well, and the great thing, this pandemic lasted for 16 months, and it's not going to be overnight to fix these issues. We've got 3 years to use this federal money. We have till September of 2024.
Yeah.
So it doesn't need to be overnight. We just need to use it wisely over the next few years.
That's a great point. I mean, people expect we get the money and spend it right away. And sometimes when you get into that spending right away, that creates other kinds of problems because you're not using the money very wisely.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go to the last topic, and we have about a minute and a half left. What other priorities do you have?
Well, I think, there's a major issue right now with the amount of educators that are available. In our state, we used to really produce a lot of educators in this state, and it's dropped significantly over the last decade. And we think it's imperative at PSEA to really try and recruit educators of color. 33% of our student population are students of color, but only about 5% actually of our educators are of color. And we really think it's important to try and recruit and make education something that they would consider. And this will help our supply of educators across the state. It's just really tough right now.
Well, I'll tell you, it also raised concerns about support staff.
Absolutely.
And I guess to put it this way, we now know how important they really are if we neglected to understand that before.
Our support staff, as well as our educators, they're the greatest resource that our state has to offer. And they have done such amazing things over this past year and a half. And everybody in Pennsylvania has seen it, and they applaud their efforts.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. Obviously, when you're dealing with students, as I pointed out, at 1.7 million students, 500 school districts, we're not talking about a subject that doesn't have a great import. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.